right, let's go back to the book of Ruth for a few minutes, and then we'll have some conversation that Tim will help moderate, where we try to unpack this in the ways that are most relevant for you all. And I guess I want to frame this last section with this question. Who has the power to redeem? That is, who can act? Oops, hold on. I hit the wrong button. Who can act in a way that actually creatively restores? Who can act in a way that is sacrificial, that is not just ethical, that can change the systems in a way that can bring restoration to those who have lost a lot? And so, of course, this is the question that actually everyone would know faced Naomi as she returns to Bethlehem and changes her name to the bitter one, Mara, because there is a system in Israel of redemption. There's a plan that's laid out in the law for who ought to redeem, and it has to do with kinship. There's this Hebrew word, as you know, for this person, the kinsman redeemer, the next of kin, who will step in at a moment when someone has ended up in bondage or lost something. And it's the responsibility of that next of kin to become the redeemer. And this would have been what an ancient Israelite would have thought of when he said, "Who's your redeemer?" They had not yet met the capital R redeemer, we might say, the one who redeemed the whole world by his blood. They would have thought of their next of kin, who, if they got in trouble, would step in. And of course, this is part of why Naomi has returned to Bethlehem, is in hopes that there will be a redeemer for her in this multiple catastrophe situation, that someone will step in and set her free from bondage, redeem the land of her deceased husband, and restore his line, restore his story in a way, their family story in Bethlehem and in Israel. And there is this guy, Boaz. So the interesting thing is that when we meet Boaz, Naomi knows that he's a relative, maybe not entirely clear how things start out, but Ruth is sent to glean in Boaz's field. And I think it's significant that even in the initial meeting with Boaz, we see that this is someone who lives, at the very least, an ethical life. That is to say, he is actually living by the law of gleaning. And the law of gleaning actually required a kind of sacrifice, because the basic idea was, rather than harvesting or having the young men who worked for you harvest all the way to the edges of your field, you would sacrifice the grain on the edge of your field, so that those without land, the poor, the landless, would be able to have the dignity of doing their own work. This is the beautiful difference between gleaning and charity, is that it provides for good work, not just for good stuff. It's not just a handout, it's an opportunity to have the dignity of doing the agricultural harvest. And so Ruth joins the gleaners in their daily work of harvesting at the edge of Boaz's field. So Boaz is already living, I think we could say, not just ethically, but in a routine way. He's sacrificing. He's not he's not harvesting, reaping to the edge of all that he can take. He's leaving something for others and consecrating that to God. And then the other thing about gleaning is, of course, the people who undertook it were very vulnerable. They would have included women who had no male relative to serve as their protector in a patriarchal society. And it's a very, very dangerous place to be. It's a place where a lot of harassment happens. There are a lot of off-color jokes about what happens at the edges of the field to the gleaners when the young men and the young gleaning women are out there. And very interestingly, Boaz knows full well that this can go on, and he instructs his young man, do not bother this immigrant, vulnerable young woman. Do not bother her. Everyone knows what he means by that. And so he lays out a kind of parameters for how life is going to go on in his field that makes room for Ruth to have the dignity of providing for herself and for her mother-in-law. And in the course of this, they start to get to know each other. And Ruth and Naomi, and probably Boaz as well, realize something more could possibly happen here. And so let's pick up the story where Naomi realizes that maybe Boaz has the power to redeem. Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. Now here is our kinsman Boaz. with whose young women you have been gleaning, working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now, wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And Ruth said to Naomi, all that you tell me, I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor. Let me just pause for a moment and say, if there are a lot of jokes about the field, there are even more jokes about the threshing floor. The threshing floor, late at night, no one's around, a perfect place for what in the old days they called assignations, a perfect place for illicit encounters, a perfect place for exploitation. The threshing floor is not just a place where wheat gets threshed, it's a place where lots of things happen off the record. And it's a place where authority and vulnerability can have very fraught encounters. What happens there for Boaz and Ruth? Well, when Boaz had eaten and drunk, I like this line, and he was in a contented mood. Been working all day, had a big meal. Also, just pick up the note of how prosperous he is. This is the wealthy who lie down at the end of a long day, having had a good meal, a good bottle of wine. In the midst of a lot of calamity, there are people who lie down in a contented mood, even in the worst environments. He went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then Ruth came stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" It's dark. No idea who this is. And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." Now, what is happening in this moment? Well, obviously, we know Ruth is asking Boaz to step in and redeem. But I think more is happening in this incredibly interesting encounter on the threshing floor, because there would have been many ways to approach Boaz. And Ruth, by the instruction of her mother, the direction of her mother-in-law, approaches in the most vulnerable possible way. Now, she has washed and bathed, she's put on her best clothes, as her mother-in-law instructs, but she now shows up in a place where every interpretation of her arrival would be that she is about to, shall we say, expose herself to great vulnerability and put herself in a position of tremendous compromise. This is a very, very high stakes moment for Ruth. And then she uncovers Boaz's feet. Now, if you have read through your Hebrew Bible, you may have picked up that feet can, of course, simply refer to the two ends, the appendages at the end of our legs. But it is also a euphemism in Hebrew. It's a euphemism for the genitals, for the human genitalia. And it seems very likely that when Ruth uncovers Boaz, she does not just uncover the very bottom of his legs, but that this is being used euphemistically in a way that everyone reading the story, of course, would have understood. She throws off his cloak. And so Boaz awakens, startled, turned over. He's no longer wearing the cloak with which he clothed himself after his contented dinner. And there's a woman. What is going on here? The most natural interpretation is this is the ultimate proposition, the ultimate sexual invitation. But I actually think something else is happening. And the amazing thing is that Boaz gets it. I think what Ruth is doing by uncovering Boaz is an invitation, not first of all to a moment of sexual availability or exploitation, but an invitation to vulnerability. I think she is implicitly saying, Boaz, do you feel what it's like to wake up and suddenly realize you're unclothed, you're naked? Imagine waking up, realizing that. That's how it feels to be me. That's how it feels to be Ruth. That's how it feels to be Naomi. That's how vulnerable they are. This man who's been provided for, has had a great meal, has wrapped himself in a warm cloak, suddenly in the cold midnight, awake, naked, in the presence of another, thrown off guard. That's how it feels. That's how hard it is to be in this situation of total vulnerability, totally exposed to the world. And Boaz understands, and rather than interpreting it as some kind of offer of availability, he sees it as the plea for help and solidarity that it is. And he provides a way for Ruth to escape with her honor intact. No one's going to see her leave. It's very clear nothing transpires sort of illicit between them that night. Instead, he says, I will be your redeemer. And there's actually two redeemers in this story. So on the one hand, indeed, Boaz the next day steps in to redeem Ruth and her family. But there's a very interesting little twist to the story, which is, and he says it on the threshing floor in the middle of the night. He says, actually, I'm not your legal kinsman redeemer. I'm not the closest next of kin. There's another man in Bethlehem who, by law, by the Torah, would be required to step in and purchase Elimelech's land, marry Ruth in order to reestablish the family line. And he's in town. Why this gentleman has not gotten involved up to this point, why he's not aware of what's going on, not entirely clear. But Boaz knows that legally, Boaz has no obligation. I think this is actually very significant. The ethical thing is for this other guy to do what the law requires. He has a role. The law is prescribed for him to play. Keep the law. I don't know if it's going to be win-win, but it's your job. If you're the kinsman redeemer, this is, of course, here it comes up in a question for Jesus. So a man died. He left a wife. Who marries her? And there's this kind of absurd situation where it happens 7 times. Well, each time the guy's like, okay, I got to marry her. I'm the kinsman redeemer. But Boaz is not acting out of ethical obligation. He has come to love Ruth. He's not just come to love Ruth. He's come to respect Ruth, to honor Ruth, to see what an amazing set of choices she's made to love and serve her mother-in-law. And he wants to step in sacrificially to do something he doesn't have to do because of love. So he goes to the gate, as you know, the next day. And it's a very interesting conversation because he says to the guy, hey, Elimelech's land needs to be bought. And the guy says, well, I'd love to buy that land. I'd love to add to my, territory, as it were. And then Boaz says, and you will have to marry Ruth, the Moabite. And at that point, the legal next of kin does not want anything to do with it because he will be sacrificing his family line. If he marries Ruth, his offspring will be reckoned as part of the line of Elimelech. This is the whole point of bringing this family back into Israel. And he doesn't want to give up his proper line. And so he finds, Boaz offers him an ethical way out. If you'll agree to this transaction, you can maintain your family line, Boaz says, and I will step in. And the line of descent will be reckoned through Elimelech. Rather than my family kind of getting the lineage, the patrimony, the Elimelech family will get it. But I get Ruth, which for Boaz has now figured out is a great deal. I sacrifice, we win, right? And indeed, that's what happens, right? So Boaz is this amazing model. If you had asked Jesus of Nazareth, who's the Redeemer in the Hebrew Bible? I think he would have said Boaz. I think everyone in Jesus' time knew this story and knew this was like the ultimate story of someone who sacrificed so that someone could be restored, and who created a new we. But I think Ruth is also a redeemer in this story. Ruth also sacrifices. Back in that scene where she and her fellow sister-in-law, Orpah, are with their mother-in-law, and her mother-in-law has decided to return to Bethlehem, what happens? Orpah does the ethical thing. Orpah, who gets only one line in the Bible, doesn't even get a spoken line, I don't think, kisses her mother-in-law. There's no lack of affection. There's no lack of... But Orpah's a Moabite. This is her home. Why would you leave your homeland, your home country, your home language, your people? Orpah turns around, having properly honored Naomi, done everything ethics requires. But Ruth says, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. A huge sacrifice to say, I'll no longer really be part of Moab. Your people are my people, and your God will be my God. And until death, I'm with you. And what? It's so significant. Ruth says, your God will be my God. She places everything she's giving up, leaving her home country, all that she's leaving. She puts it in the context of a sacred horizon and says, even to my death, I'm going to lose my life in order to love and serve you, Naomi. It's so interesting that each of these redeemers has a kind of ethical counterpart, someone who doesn't do anything wrong. Neither the unnamed relative nor Orpah do anything in the end that's illegal, unethical. But Boaz and Ruth act for creative restoration through sacrifice, both of them. And what's restored? Well, Naomi is back. By the end of the story, she's not Mara anymore. She's Naomi. Sweetness, pleasantness. And actually Elimelech, the dead guy, we don't really get to see much of him in the story because he dies before it really starts. But he's restored. His name is not forgotten. His line and his land persist in Israel. So that's the restoration. But then there's this creative part, because this really does create a new we. The sacrifice of Ruth and Boaz creates a new we, and they win. They have a child named Obed. He has a child named Jesse. They have other children as well. And only 2 generations later, these are the great grandparents, right, of David, who becomes king. This is creative restoration, not just in the sense that children come from this relationship, but one arises in Israel, the last of a long number of brothers, who is remembered ever after for all of his faults and all his own exploitation, as the king who placed the worship of God and the justice of God at the center of Israel's life, who ended this chaotic reign of the judges, who embodied a kind of faithfulness to God and was a person after God's own heart. He is the great grandson of Ruth and Boaz. And imagine what it was like to grow up in Jesse's family, Obed's grandsons and granddaughters, hearing this story of sacrifice and faithfulness, how that reshapes your ethical horizon, how that reshapes what it means to be a man. Think about how what it is to be a man and a woman is rearranged by this story. And obviously, as Luke makes clear when he picks this up and gives us his genealogy, and Matthew in their genealogies, this ultimately is the line of Jesus, the ultimate Redeemer, the true Redeemer. But Bethlehem is also restored. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep, the silent stars go by. The only reason Phillips Brooks could write that hymn and have it sound right to us, have it sound like, yes, Bethlehem. Bethlehem's where you would go. Bethlehem's where people are taken in, where even if every room is full, some room is found in a manger. Bethlehem, the city of David, is now restored and is now a word for a kind of peace, a kind of justice, true and righteous reign. The kingdom of God takes up residence in Bethlehem, the place that at the beginning of the book of Ruth was the place you would never want to go. These are the dimensions of restoration, all of which funnel through these 2 persons, each of whom decides to act as a redeemer. So just to finish up here, this is how God saves the world. This is why when we were having to come up with words for what God did on the cross, of course we thought of redemption, because the one who could have never gone down to the threshing floor, the one who could have stayed clothed in power, made himself vulnerable, came to the places of injustice, suffered, made himself totally naked on the cross, emptied himself, took on the form of a servant, sacrificed everything, did what he did not have to do, so that he could create a new we that we call his body, the body of Christ, all those who have been gathered up in his sacrificial redemptive story. And it was creative restoration. It wasn't just restoring the kingdom of Israel. It was breaking open the gifts of Israel for the whole earth, for every tribe, nation, people, tongue, including us on this call. This is how God saves the world, through these acts of sacrifice that lead to creative restoration. Glory to God. And it is then, I think, how we serve the world. Our job is not to save the world. Sometimes when we use the word redemptive, people get uncomfortable because they say, well, isn't God the Redeemer? Yes, God is the Redeemer. God's the one who stepped in when we were completely helpless, completely vulnerable, when every system was broken, when nothing could be done. God stepped in. But now we serve the world, not save, but serve, in the same pattern. And we figure out, where are the Bethlehems? Where are the places that need redemption? Who are the Naomis? How can we be the Ruths? How can we be the Boazes? How can we enter into this amazing partnership between those who have everything to lose and those who have everything to hold on to? The Ruths of the world, the most poor, can be redeemers. The Boazes of the world, the most powerful, can be redeemers. And we enter into these blessed alliances that sometimes literally lead to children, but in a deeper way lead to the bringing of new life, God's new wine, God's Spirit into the world. That's what we're called to do in the midst of multiple catastrophes, in the midst of calamity, in a time when everyone does what's right in their own eyes. Here we are. It's our day. Somewhere in some little town in our region, someone's making a sacrifice today. And it is going to pay off generations from now in righteousness and justice and the name of God being known and honored. And people will speak of our places with the kind of reverence that we speak of Bethlehem, if we will be the redemptive people we're called to be.